Hello puppets of the internet and welcome to episode 4 of Stairway Mountain Hill Climb, where today we have the Legrand Custom. It's powered by a 3.8 litre supercharged V6, making just over 200 horsepower, and that is a lot for a front wheel drive car. However, these things aren't bad handling cars at all, and this does have better tyres and I guess you could say wheels than the standard sport variant, yet for whatever weird reason costs the same. So this is naturally the one I would go for. This car sits in line with today's theme, which is budget sports saloons, and they're cars that are under 5,000 credits in game. This is 4,350 if I remember correctly, so it offers quite good value for money in terms of what power you get. I mean, a lot of them are sub 200 horsepower cars, so to break that barrier, that is in its own way very impressive. And as you'll see around these corners, it is holding a decent level of performance. Although, there is one thing that I have to get out of my way. The elephant in this smallish car, I guess you could say, and it's not the engine for once, it's the fact that it has no roll cage. It handles so well, but the stiffness just isn't here. I mean, these are not stiff cars when you crash, so it really does need the roll cage in order to provide that extra level of stiffness and somewhat equalise it to a more modern vehicle. Now, as far as it copes with bumps, I have to say not great. It is lower and it is stiffer. I mean, what do you expect? It is not the most refined vehicle in the world, but it corners very well. And that's something you can say in its favour. It's also quite quick. Not the very quickest we've seen. It wouldn't break 100 if you really pushed it. So, that's not great, but it would go, and it would go quicker than a lot of other vehicles would, so you can take that away. And around the tighter, twistier sections, as I said, it's got very grippier tyres, which were lovely up there because they just gripped far better than you would expect, and they really helped propel it to the finish line in a quick time. Speaking of the quick time, we got an 8 minutes 4.450 time, which actually puts it a few seconds above the Bolide Corsair Competizione. About 8 seconds, give or take, and just over 30 seconds slower than the ETK 800 series we've had round recently. So, all in all, that is quite impressive, and remember, we can say a Bolide has been beaten by an 80s economy car. A modified 80s economy car even, which I guess brings to your mind an image of a Weiser, or it does with my mind at least, so that's good. And it's also only 5th on the overall standings. It is a properly impressive car for what this is. Anyway, on to the next vehicle. So, our next car is this thing that looks like a 1980s Honda Prelude. It is, however, a rear-wheel drive Pessima. The Pessima Coupe, as it's called. This is basically all the same engines and interior and everything from the 1980s Pessima. However, it's got rear-wheel drive, and that has some, let's say, interesting effects on the handling. It does tend to be fine early on in the course, where all the corners are open, where all the corners you have the space to work with, you have the space to maneuver the car. However, as things quickly start getting tighter and you have to quickly accelerate from a lower speed, that's where it gets interesting, because the rear-wheel drive really gets you there. The tyres just don't have the grip. I'll also mention, though, this is the ZX model I'm using. There are better variants which will probably grip better, but this version with these tyres and wheels, I guess they just don't have the tread on them for a rear-wheel drive car. They were fine on the front-wheel drive, but on a rear, not so much. And that's why as you get to the tighter parts of the circuit, as I was saying, it'll really spin up those wheels if you're not careful, as it did for me. And it just likes to generally spin up the wheels and get in slides because of it. It's kind of fun and challenging, no doubt, but it is not quick. It is not the quick way to take corners. Also, this vehicle is notably a lot slower than the Leguan we had just because, well, it's 60 horsepower down, maybe a bit more. So that's never good. And I'd say it makes less torque as well because there's no supercharger atop the little inline 4 that's in here. But it's a interesting car still. I'd rather have this tested than have one not tested, since it's a very old mod now, and it's amazing that it still works as well as it does. I don't believe it's received any updates in the past few months, so the fact that it still works perfectly, like every part I can see of it works, well, that's definitely not a bad thing. I did consider this against the ZX Oriole Steer Pessima, which is slightly more expensive but still within budget. That's the regular Pessima I'm talking about. However, I did ultimately choose this as I decided rear-wheel drive would be more interesting. Given I do still think the ZX Oriole Steer would be quicker, and that probably had better tyres as well, actually, coming to think of it. But this was within budget, and it provides you with a very good entryway into a rear-wheel drive car. So, all in all, it put in a great performance. It set a time of 8:55.235, which is quite a bit below the Leguan by, you know, just over 50 seconds. That is not a small amount of time. Although it's less powerful, so we kind of expect that. But I think it was mainly the oversteer that held it back more than the power output of the car. Also, I've just realised disc brakes all around. Not that that's going to save it this late in the one. It is below the Moonhawk NASCAR by a few seconds, so hey, what does that say about controllability? That car at least had a huge, powerful V8 to somewhat compensate for its lack of control. This just doesn't have any kind of brute power there to compensate for it, and the time is as such. The Kashira, however, is beaten. We've beaten an MPV, so, you know, there's that. I'll also briefly mention that this being the ZX, the suspension settings are slightly sportier than if it had been another regular trim. So that's a thing to know about it. But anyway, I think I've said about all I can say, really, with this car, so on to the next vehicle. So, here we have the Pessima 3.0 TCCI LXV6, and although it is technically a Pessima, it bears very little in resemblance to the car we've just had. For example, this has a V6 instead of an inline 4, and it's front-wheel drive, and 186 horsepower going to those front wheels, so the front wheels are more loaded up, I guess, than the rear wheels of a previous car. Although, having said that, you wouldn't know it from the handling. I mean, this is when cars were getting more refined, I would say. Less sporty than the older Pessima. The older Pessima, standard Pessima, that is, not the coupe, would beat this, provided it had the right parts on it. It would easily beat this. However, in terms of the balancing act this car has to do, which is being comfortable and being quick all at the same time, I would argue it does quite a good job. You'll see around the corners it does understeer, as you can expect from a front wheel drive, but I would rather have this understeer than the older case of where it was oversteering all the time. Well, not all the time technically, but it was just more prone to oversteer, so I prefer the safer handling dynamics that this presents to its driver. It's also reasonably quick on the straights. We must remember though, it's slower than the Leguan, not slower, but less in terms of power by about 15 horsepower, although a fair amount more than the Pessima Coupe, so it has stuff going for it. That's the simplest way to put it. It has things going for it, even if it's not the most powerful in the world. And in terms of what it can manage outright, it was able to manage 92 miles per hour there or thereabouts, and that's not bad. I mean, again, we've seen cars do over 100. We've seen the very highest end cars do well over 100 up this hill, but this is, remember, a car that you would have been able to buy off the showroom floor, so that is definitely something that has to play in its advantage. It's also relatively refined, although I don't know how the sport suspension would be better if I'm entirely honest. I mean, having driven all of these Pessimas, the sport versions just feel really firm over rough terrain. So why would you even bother with one of those variants? I don't know. But this particular terrain, up Stairway Mountain, you could probably deal with a sport Pessima's suspension, and maybe that would help it. But anyway, we need to talk about the cornering a bit more on the higher parts of the course where, yes, it does spin the tyres up. It has not got track tyres, that is an inevitability. As I say, it's a road car that you could buy from dealerships. What do you really expect? You can't expect everything to feel like a Formula 1 car in that respect. I had no problems with the stiffness of the vehicle, probably because the suspension was soft enough to compensate for it. I'd imagine if it was lowered like the Legrand and stiffened and on track tyres, I would suddenly notice it weren't stiff enough, but in this case it was fine. As for the actual time it set, it achieved a 8:25.612 time. Not bad. Not bad at all, although it is about 1 minute 20 slower than the SBR4 hill climb. That is still okay. And it has come, surprisingly enough, just below the Covet Tofu delivery. But remember, the Covet Tofu delivery had a fair few bits on it, so performance bits. So although that was maybe less powerful, maybe a bit more powerful, it was overall more trackified in a much lighter car. So to come close to that by about 7 seconds slower, but to come that close to a car in many ways built to go up or down a hill, that's not too bad. We've also beaten the Maluch by 9-ish seconds, and that is reasonably impressive again. Although the Maluch was seriously lacking in power, having 80 horsepower, it was very light and very grippy, so the vehicle's done well for, again, what is just a showroom saloon car. It's really not too dreadful. And with that being said, on to the next vehicle. So here we have the Mercedes C200 Esprit. This being the Esprit, it is a 2-litre model with a sport suspension, and that's basically it. It's slightly sportier than the other version, which is the standard base model, and has a 1.8-litre engine. It also has no textures everywhere, but we won't worry about that for now, it's just because it's an older mod. Anyway, this vehicle is pretty decent to drive. It does oversteer when you really push it, but for the most part it's able to hold itself in, it's able to keep itself gripping to a road, even though it only has about 130 horsepower. It is not powerful as far as German cars go, but I wanted to use something German because of the variety it would provide. And the ETK I-Series, you can only ever use the base model within budget, which doesn't have any sport suspension or anything of the kind like this does have. So that's why I ultimately chose the Esprit over that car. As Esprit, I don't mean Lotus Esprit, I mean Mercedes Esprit, although it's a confusion that can so obviously be made easily. Anyway, as it goes, you can see it's gripping, and I'm not having any trouble complaining about driving it. It's just not hard in the slightest. As I say, it will step out, but when it does step out, it's easy to contradict. It's not like certain cars where they snap you got no chance of recovering them. A high-power SBR4, for example, would be a car that's like that, where it snaps and then it's just gone before you can afford to do anything about it. However, this is easy, although it does only go about 85 horsepower. You'd expect that. 85 horsepower, 85 miles per hour. You'd expect that being a 130-ish horsepower car. It's not powerful, but I'm not worrying about the power because there's bigger things to worry about than power, as this proves by beating the Pessima Coupe in terms of time. As it does deal with atrocities so well, it just tackles them and flies out of them, really, without too much concern. As for the time it's set an 8:39.717, which puts it above the Roma XL V8 4-wheel drive XT 7-seater. Try saying that 7 times fast. I can't even speak now, and I'm not saying it 7 times fast. That is just under 5 seconds quicker, I think, and it is a few seconds, about 5 seconds slower than the Maluch convertible tune. So, you know, if it can come up to a relatively well-tuned, sporty little car like that, in what is just a standard Mercedes from the 90s, I don't think that's too bad in its own right, really. And what else we've come? We've come above the Moonhawk NASCAR. We've come above the camper van, as you would expect. But the Legrand Custom has destroyed it still. We just can't compete with that level of performance. It's just not track built, and it's not got that kind of power. But anyway, moving on. So, here we have a red Caprice. It's the Brougham Custom, and it has lots of chrome, some wood on the dashboard, as you would have seen in the last Caprice, which was a diesel. But it also has something different in it. Yeah, I hope that explains it. It's got a 270 thereabouts horsepower V8. Not sure about the torque, but I'm sure it's a lot, being a large American engine. And it's beginning to, at this point, feel like a proper muscle car, feel like a proper sports car even, because it gets going around these corners. Even though it does slide at times, it's generally quite an easy vehicle to control. More of a problem would be how soft the suspension is, but knowing me, I like my suspension soft and cushy anyway, so, you know, it's good for some people, I guess you could say. It's very much a dad car, but for a very, very angry dad, if that makes sense. Just look at how red the interior is. This is an angry version of the Caprice, and it shows. The Caprice is just tired of being the laughingstock of a leaderboard. Well, admittedly, not the laughingstock of a leaderboard, that would be the camper van. But the fact that it's beaten by a pigeon, you know, the Caprice wants revenge, and the Caprice is coming back at it the only way Americans know how to, with large V8s and rear-wheel drive. The automatic transmission, I've not mentioned yet, it's not a hindrance actually. Oddly, I would normally say an automatic is a transmission hindrance that limits the engine, for lack of a better way of saying it. However, it doesn't feel like it's limiting the engine. It feels like this has the power and the torque to pull through, regardless of having an automatic transmission. Would it be better with a manual? Yes, definitely, but it's not got a manual, and I'm not going to go and complain too much because it's otherwise a very good car. The automatic, though, does have the advantage that I don't need to think about the gears. The gears will just sort themselves out, so, you know, that's one less problem, at least, you could say. And overall, the speed I was able to hit was about 95. I have to say I'm disappointed in that, though. I know it's not an aerodynamic car, but we're talking around about double, maybe even a little more than that previous Mercedes had. So to come that slow in terms of speed outright, it's just not good. I would have expected more from it. I mean, maybe I'm expecting too much, but it's still a relatively powerful car, and that alone should give it more top-end speed than I was seeing. However, all being said and done, I mean, the thing was remarkably good round corners, considering how heavy, large it is, and that it has drum brakes on the back, so we can push this where we can push it. Talking of pushing it, we pushed it up on the leaderboard from the Mercedes. It is now just above the Maluch, which is just above the C-Class, and that is maybe not like truly remarkable or anything, but it kind of restores the Caprice's honour. You know, it at least shows it as a less embarrassing car. It's also come a couple of seconds, actually around about 6 seconds behind the Pessima 3-litre turbo diesel. Again, that's a less powerful vehicle, but that would have felt a lot more focused on a track anyway, so this is much more of a luxury car in how it rides. As I was saying, the suspension is extremely soft. That could very well have been a hindrance to its time, but the suspension made it fun. I have to say that the suspension's part of the experience, and so I'm more grateful that it's as soft as it is, because otherwise it just wouldn't be the same. But anyway, there's not too much more to say on this, so on to the next vehicle. Okay, so this is our final vehicle, and it is our first Czech vehicle. It is a rear-engined Skoda with about 80 horsepower. Doesn't sound that impressive, no. However, the handling is perhaps not what you would expect from a safe, family-friendly type of vehicle. It is very slidey, and there's no other way to put it. The vehicle is slidey. If you were to imagine an arcade game in how that would perhaps represent slidey, then this car is exactly that. It is just every corner it wants to slide. You can hold it back, and quite easily too, but that's because it's got no power. If you tried to load this with power, I imagine it would really want to slide out on you, which is interesting because the Maluch had the same driveline, and that was very grippy, at least for the most part. It did lift the front end a fair bit, but that was quite grippy. This doesn't have the same front end lifting that did, at least in the higher variants, but it does slide. I don't know why. You'd think the engine being over the rear wheels would give it loads of grip, as was the case with the Maluch, but in this case, no. It slides all the time. And this is actually a pretty old car as well. It was made from 1976 to 1990 apparently, so it's a classic sports car to say the least, and made for over 10 years is impressive. The speeds I was able to achieve in this were quite impressive, I would say, for an 80 horsepower car. The fact that it was able to hit 75 miles per hour, for example, only 10 miles per hour down on the Mercedes. Although the speed of the Caprice was pretty much disappointing to me. The Caprice had a lot more power. The Caprice had, well, over 3 times the power of this. So the fact that it can do 20 miles per hour more, sure, it would be able to, but then you expect more sports car performance from that. I mean, it does hold its own for what it is. It's just I wish it slid less. It maybe needs grippier tyres, but I honestly don't feel that's the problem. I feel the problem is more to do with the balance of the vehicle. The problem is more to do with how it's built up, and there's not really much you can do about that without redesigning it, re-engineering it. Also, more power would perhaps help it. It could be quick, but it feels like the kind of vehicle that needs all-wheel drive as well as more power. Maybe it would be a bit twitchy then, but it could become like the SBR4, which I believe is currently our second quickest vehicle on the leaderboard. Speaking of which, we're above the Pigeon, which is a 9:22.486 as our time, and a 9:27.417 as the Pigeon's time, so we're about 5 seconds quicker than the Pigeon. And we're below the Kashira by about 20 seconds. So yes, it's been beaten by an Ibishu MPV. But again, the Ibishu MPV had a serious amount more power, as much as 100 horsepower, and it cornered well as well. The Kashira, I would say, cornered better than this. It was just a lot more predictable. We've also beaten the Diesel Caprice, so hey, we have beaten one Caprice. Even though this is less powerful than that Caprice, although to be fair, it's a diesel and it's not designed for speed in any way in that car. We've come below the Passima Coupe ZX as well, and the Moonhawk NASCAR. So basically, the whole leaderboard other than 4 cars. And one of those 4 cars is a van, anyway, a camper van. So with that being said, I think that's about it. I mean, it held itself together just enough not to be an embarrassment, not to be a laughing stock, and about no more. But anyway, I'm going to leave it here for today, and until next time, I'll say goodbye until another day.